So yeah, when the black pines, they're kept in the temperate house here, and so as a result of that, they start to come out of dormancy earlier. And this is just something that I found that helps particular black pines in the Pacific Northwest because they just tend to do better with a longer growing season. They take so much longer to come out of dormancy because it's so cold. So having them in here really helps give them a jump start. And so it's already, it's early January, and we're already seeing the buds. In particular, you kind of look at that one. There you go. You can just see how plump that is. And if you sort of start to look throughout the tree, you'll see these buds are really indicating that they're starting to swell in preparation for growing the growing season. So we're kind of entering the window for repotting, in particular for the black pine. So what this means is we're going to come through and we're going to do our needle reduction work and go through and balance the needles on the trees that aren't being repotted, and then go through and kind of make sure they're all evenly distributed, the needle groups, and maybe even do some light trimming. It's also our chance to cut back as the trees are starting to wake up. And so yeah, believe it or not, we're already seeing the buds swelling on our black pines. So yeah, needle plucking, is a basic technique for black pine bonsai maintenance, and so we're trying to have an even distribution of needles throughout the tree. We had some dieback a few years ago, so the top's a little bit weaker, and so some of these buds in here, we're not going to be removing a ton of needles, but down kind of in here, this zone, it's pretty dense. And so, essentially what that looks like is we're going to go in and look for opportunities to remove any older needles that are typically in the 3-year-old range. Also just keeping aware of any small buds that are going to be setting up, so we can count backwards on the shoot to tell which year needles we're plucking. Last year's needles, this is 2 years ago, and then this is all 3rd-year needles down here. So I can come in with my tweezers and just pluck off the 3rd-year needles, but keeping an eye on any buds. That's a bud right there. So I don't want to take the needles around that one because it's going to be developing into a shoot. So, but also I'll leave these needles, but then I'm just going to, and then I'll pluck a few of the 2nd-year needles just to, again, lighten that load because we've got so many on this one shoot. And maybe just 1 or 2 of the needles from last year. So we're going to kind of have that needle distribution of old and new. These tweezers are a little bit not as tight as you'd like, so I'm going to use my fingers to finish that off there. And then essentially we'll go through each bud and look at it and remove the 3rd-year needles that we don't want, and a few 2nd, and maybe even a few of the last year's. So that essentially, when we're done, the quantity of needles per shoot is closer to its neighbor than throughout the tree. So we don't have areas of extreme vigor and weakness. It's going to close that gap so that the whole tree is going to have an even, the buds are going to come out in an even distribution or even vigor in the springtime. So stuff that's really strong, we're going to take more off of, and stuff that's weaker, we're going to leave more needles. So some people find it helpful to count the number of needles till they get that kind of idea of how many they need to actually have from a visual standpoint, but it's helpful to stand back and look at the tree because you can see the density kind of helps you guide where you need to kind of work. So we can start to see a little bit more through the tree, which is going to allow better sunlight too. In addition to the distribution of energy at each shoot, we're going to allow more sunlight to get into the lower portions of the tree. And in here we've got a lot of nice small back buds setting up, so that will help those start to develop a little bit better. Whereas if it was too dense, these might die off. So we're trying to also encourage the development of these back buds as well. So this is a cork bark black pine, and you can see that the buds are a little bit Actually, that one, these are both cork barks, but they're all kind of at different stages. I would say that one's probably the most furthest along, whereas this one still has some pretty tight buds that are dormant. So this one here is one that hasn't really started to grow. You can see it's also pretty weak from its size, but over the following weeks, these will all start to swell, and that's just the indicator we're looking for to tell us that the trees are starting to get ready for growth. So needle plucking is an important component for refining trees. Trees that are in refinement, like the cork bark. This one has been in development for a lot of the last 4 or 5 years. Some areas are in refinement, but these branches here have been sort of encouraged to grow out. So even there's been some cleaning up of the bottom of that branch just to keep it looking nice. But this is a great example where you can see the years of needles along a branch, and so we see this. Let's see here. We see this last year's shoot. Then we have the year before, and then the year before that, and then the year before that. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 years of needles, including the bud. So that those needles will merge, but all of these needles were kept. This wasn't necessarily. We didn't clean off all of the older needles, but because we want to maintain more needles to encourage this branch to elongate. So we were trying to get this longer. Keeping more needles encourages that vigor. However, if you look, there are fewer of the oldest needles and more needles as we sort of move along that branch. So this year, we'll look to maybe take all of the 4-year-old needles off completely, leaving the 3rd, 2nd, and last years to continue that development, but with the a little bit of needle plucking around here in the 2nd year needles will help kind of slow it down a little bit. We don't want to quite take all the steam out of this branch, but just kind of keeping it a little bit more balanced than we have been to start to slow that down, because we're getting to the point where the length is getting good, and it was candled last year, meaning we cut the bud and got this shorter shoot and a smaller secondary bud here. So there was an effort made to stop that and start that transitioning from a development to a refinement phase for this particular branch.